Welcome back to the MLB Draft Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Averill, co-founder of AWM Capital, and I am joined today by my co-host, former Major League pitcher and certified private wealth advisor, Travis Chick. And Travis, the conversation we want to pick back up on from the last episode is really talking about the fact that baseball, yes, is a game, but professional baseball is a business. One of the things that we like to always start the conversations with amateur families is really pointing out what is the difference between an amateur and a professional athlete. And simply it's money, right? You go from one day of being a high school or college amateur player that then with one pick in selection from the podium, right? And you ink your name to that piece of paper, you are now a professional athlete.
Right.
And really what makes you a pro is that there is compensation coming down the pike. And so that's the conversation we want to have over the next few minutes, is really bring to light what is the industry of professional baseball and what is the business that you currently sit in.
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but the reality is this is a very big industry. It goes all the way down through when you start playing select ball, you're seeing these tournaments kind of build up and you start realizing that it's becoming a business. And then you go through the perfect game and you start seeing it becoming more of a business. And then you ink your name on a piece of paper and you're starting to get actually paid. And you enter into this industry, this tightness industry that's an $11 billion industry. In 2022, they actually set a record for the revenue, over $11.9 billion, so almost $12 billion. It's a massive, massive business, and you're just a piece of the puzzle to help grow that business. But to really affirm that this truly is a business, and it's not personal decisions, we saw this firsthand in 2021 when the owners actually locked out the players. And just take into context, if you were an injured player at that point and you're needing rehab, they actually locked you away from being able to go and see their trainers. Like, that's how much they didn't care about you. This is truly a business. And the owners that are going to run this business are viewing this through the lens of how are we going to monetize and maximize the product on the field to maximize our profits.
Yeah, and I think we see this once again with Major League Baseball moving the draft to the All-Star weekend. Right. The main driver of that is how do we get more eyeballs, right? How do we make this a more lucrative deal, not only for the draft, but really the MLB All-Star weekend? And going back to something you said interesting is it's not just once you become a professional athlete.
Right.
It's what's happening in the amateur ranks. A lot of the best players in the country have participated in the Perfect Game All-American game.
Right.
And what an amazing experience.
Yeah, it's great.
But Perfect Game USA, it's been estimated that they did $84 million in revenue, right? Let that sink into you, is $84 million. This is an industry that is ripe and is focused on the almighty dollar. Right. And the first thing I want to clarify here is this isn't a moral judgment. We're not saying this is good or bad. This is just the reality. This is what is. And we're going to talk about here in a second of why the MLB draft is actually the best investment for teams. And from a team perspective, if you take a step back and understand what the business is of any major league team, whether it's the New York Mets or the Los Angeles Dodgers or even the Tampa Bay Rays, right, or the Oakland A's, is they have a different approach to accomplishing it, but it's absolutely to maximize profits for the owners of the companies, right? And so you have teams like the Tampa Bay Rays or Oakland who thinks by doing this through cost effectiveness, or you have the Los Angeles Dodgers who think about, hey, yeah, I'm going to have this massive payroll, but I'm going to sell more tickets. I'm going to sell more lucrative TV contracts and have valuations north of billions of dollars for one team.
Right.
So ultimately, like any good investment, is I want to buy an investment as cheap as possible so that when it makes the most amount of money, I have the most margin, right? I've made the most profit. And that's what the Major League Baseball draft does, is that even if it's the first overall pick and they pay you $8-9 million, yes, that is life-changing money for the young player. But for the team, it's estimated that the value of that draft pick is actually worth about $45 million.
Isn't that crazy?
It is wild. And so why do they only get paid 8 or 9? Going back to the collective bargaining agreement,
Exactly.
right? And so this is a business that you are a part of right off the bat, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it goes back to, as a baseball player, your first entry point into professional baseball obviously is the draft for the most part. And so one of the first decisions that you kind of have to make is, number one, am I going to sign? Number two, do I need to hire an agent? And so I think it'd be helpful to bring into context, just in the 2022 draft alone, in the first round, this is what's kind of striking, is there was about $160 million of bonus payments paid out just in the first round, right? And so when we kind of pull that layers back and we start thinking about, okay, how does this impact? Like, what are the first costs players actually experience outside of the taxes that we'll talk about in future episodes, right, is actually the agent's fees. And so most agents typically charge between 4 and 5%. So on $158 million that were paid out, that's about $6.5 to $8 million, depending on how much they actually collected. Those are huge numbers. So it really, again, to use your words, it's not a moral judgment. It's just the reality of coming back to everything that ties into creating your value on the field is centered around the money, right? It's always going to be centered around the money. So we always talk about, again, baseball is a game, but this is a professional business.
And I think if we go back to the first episode in this podcast, you laid out how difficult it is to be successful, both on the field and financially, right? That only 38% of first round draft picks will reach arbitration.
Right.
And for those that do capture a certain amount of money, bankruptcy is 4 times more likely. And so part of this is bringing awareness and education is to go, the earlier we recognize that we're inside this business, the better we become equipped to handle it and not allow it to become a distraction. And so when we share this stuff, it's not to overwhelm you. It's to say that
it's to empower you.
It's to empower you that if you want to be a successful player and you want to have a financial outcome that's successful, is you have to own the responsibility.
Right.
This is a business, and that's owning it as a family, right? I could only imagine. I remember going through this at 18 years old, or even when we start to work with our 21-year-olds. It's overwhelming, and it takes a team, right? It takes a family to do that. But the first thing is you to really realize you are in a business. And so one of the things that I thought would be helpful is if we broke this down for the families of going, hey, the same way that the New York Mets and Steve Cohen, right, who the show Billions is named after, he's thinking very much of how do I maximize my profits? How do I run my business? Who do I put in the front office? Who do I put in player personnel? Who are the investments, the assets, the players that I put on the field? And so as a player, it'd be really helpful if you start to walk me through how should I think about my own business? Do I provide services or products or revenue, expenses? Walk me through that a little bit.
The answer is yes, all of the above, right? And so as the player, one of the first things that we try to empower you with is to understand that you are now the CEO of your own multi-million-dollar company. You are the brand. You are the asset. You are the person making these empowering decisions. And so you have to begin to really understand, how do I generate my own revenue? How do other people value me? Is it on the field? Is it through things like WAR, which, wins above replacement? As analytical as our game has become, and with the financial stakes that are out there to actually monetize that, you have to know exactly how they're valuing you, right? And so that's part of the service. The first part is on the field, right? You have to develop that skill set. If you don't have the skill set, they're not going to pay you, right? But after that, what is the product?
Yeah, I think before we go to product, one of the things you hit on that I want to really spend some time on talking about is you mentioned WAR, right? Wins above replacement. This is so clear that this is how they value you as a professional baseball player. That part of the recent CBA, right, is for players that are pre-arbitration, there's a bonus pool that is literally calculated off of WAR. And so I think first and foremost as a player to start to understand what are the things that are in your control leading up to the draft is really understand what makes you valuable. So when you start to talk about exit velocity, you start to talk about all of these analytics, do you actually understand how they come into your value? And having a game plan on how to improve, really the value of yourself should be a big focus of that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you start thinking about all the training costs, the nutrition, the coaching, the specialized attention to, making sure that you talked about exit velocity and all those things. Those are real analytically driven tangibles that they value you on. And right, so digging up all the pieces of the war on the pre-arb bonus pool, it's not just as generic as the Fangraphs war. There's a really unique a calculation that they're taking into account for this. But if the players understand what drives their value, then they can now focus on what's going to generate income for them, right? And so when we look at it, it's really making sure that our players know ahead of time going into it, like with the pre-arbitration. We want to make sure that they're empowered to understand and prepared so that when they're in that position to be in the top 100, they know where they're going to stand.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll move on to product here in a second, is that, one of the most important things to understand is when teams are evaluating you, when their scouts are out there and their scouting directors, is they're not comparing you against your current situation, right? They're actually trying to project and go, how is Travis going to make an impact at the major league level? And I think the reason that's important is a lot of times we can see the emotion creep up in the draft, and they get caught up in rankings, or even on draft day, we see this happen a lot, that the board comes off a little different than, wait a second, I think I'm better than this person currently in this year. Well, teams aren't looking at this year. They're looking down the future. So understanding war of what makes a valuable major league player is really important. And so transitioning though to—
Well, hey, just real quick, I mean, I think that's an important point that you're talking about, because, when we start talking with our clients specifically on their investments, right, there's a big difference between trading a stock and actually thinking through the lens of this is an investment.
Yeah.
Right. So when these players get drafted, it's really easy for them to sit there and say, well, hey, I throw 100 miles an hour and this is my value today, right? The team's not paying you on your value today. Like you said, they're paying you on what kind of Major League Baseball player they think you're going to be. So it's the same way we think about investing. When we buy an investment today, we're projecting out what we think that investment is going to be 5, 10, 15, maybe years in the future. It's no different than how the teams value you in the draft.
Yeah, and I think it's a great mindset on how do you build value for yourself, is really focusing on the long term to go, the goal isn't to get to the draft. It's actually that if I focus on building the best long-term value of a major league player, the draft results will take care of itself. Sure. But on the product side, name, image, and likeness, right? This has been
the buzzword right now.
This has been in the news for the last couple of years as the NCAA's been forced to adjust. The reality is name, image, and likeness has always been there for the pro, but now it's creeping into the amateur ranks, right? Sure. That you can be compensated based off of some value. So we won't spend a lot of time here. We have a whole nother, podcast series dedicated to name, image, and likeness. But the reality is the more people understand who you are and you can help companies make money, they're going to want to enter into endorsement deals with you. So whether it's you wearing, Nike, or it's you using a Rawlings glove, or signing a baseball card deal with Panini or Topps or Leaf or XYZ, there is income coming in that situation. And that brings us to really the culmination of, okay, I have this service that I provide to the teams, and I do have this product that I can provide to companies. Well, that converts and turns into what?
Money,
revenue, right?
Revenue.
And so just like any other company, Steve Cohen or any Fortune 500 company would know, is we know our finances. We actually know what generates revenue. We understand where it's coming from. But then revenue's not what actually hits our pocket. So talk a little bit, what are some of these expenses that players should start to expect, and maybe they're already incurring them?
Yeah, I mean, so the first one we already talked about was the agent fees. And that's just one of those realities that are going to come out if you hire a good agent. The first one that after the agent fees kind of paid out, the one we have to kind of focus on is the taxes. And that's just the reality. When we think through what's going to end up in your pocket, if you're thinking through it in the pie in the sky, hey, I'm going to sign for $1 million, you have to kind of understand and pull those layers back and say, I'm not going to end up with anywhere near $1 million. And we understand that. But then it starts thinking through, okay, what am I going to need to spend to become a Major League Baseball player? And this isn't hey, I'm going to spend, I'm going to hire a trainer and pay him a couple $1,000s a year. It's which trainer is the most equipped trainer in the country to make sure that he's maximizing, whatever skill set that I need to, focus on to be that major leaguer that I want to be 10 years from now, right? It's, maybe it's taking a blood test to know how your body's going to react to the food and intake that you're putting in. Maybe it's, hey, I've kind of tweaked my shoulder a little bit. What PT is the best one in the country? I love the analogy when boxers are training to fight a specific boxer, right? They pull apart the layers of that boxer that they're fighting against and maximize what skill set they're going to need to overcome that boxer's strength, right? And so as a baseball player, it's not just enough to hire the LA Fitness trainer down the street. It's which trainer in the country is most equipped to prepare me to be a major leaguer, or which dietitian is most equipped to understand, that I'm going to be eating at 11 o'clock at night. And sleeping till 11 o'clock in the morning, right? We know not to call our players before 11 o'clock in the morning because they're going to be asleep. So it's just kind of thinking through all of those impacts, making sure that my insurance is protected, that I'm protected from liability, making sure that, I have a vehicle that's going to be able to get me across country to, drive to spring training every year. Like all of these things start to build into, okay, what actually hits my bottom line?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a great word that I think is super important, and it's skill set.
Right.
One of the two things that we really want to impress here when we talk about that baseball is a business and you're the CEO of this company, that is a matter of fact, right, whether you have the skills or not. And it's really going back to why we started this podcast is we don't want you to have the story that ends up in not making it a meaningful career or not maximizing your finances, right? There's enough education out there that we can help build skill sets that you can really start to make yourself a successful CEO of your career. So understanding that these expenses are actually investment in the long-term viability of my career. And here's the other thing I would say is we close out and we get ready for the next episode is that, this is a business. $11 billion in Major League Baseball. Agents, right, of what we had talked about, millions of dollars in fees, perfect game, 80+ million in revenue. That's, once again, not a moral judgment. It's just a reality that some people might be telling you, hey, don't worry about money. Don't focus on money.
Right.
But it's kind of a joke because the whole industry is actually built on money. And what we'll get into these future episodes is you as a family have to make a money decision on what's really going to set the trajectory of your career and of your future. And so, next episode, we're going to jump into really what are these money decisions that you're going to be making as a family and how to navigate those so that you can have confidence, not only on draft day, but if you end up on campus or years down the road, as you look back and you said, you know what? We had the right mindset, the right team, and the right skill sets to maximize that opportunity. And so hopefully this episode's been helpful for you. And until next time, always be a pro.